HighBridge, a division of recorded books, presents The Opening of the Protestant Mind, How Anglo-American Protestants Embraced Religious Liberty, by Mark Valeri, read by Bob Johnson. Preface. The American public square is awash in provocative claims about religion and the nation, and about the moral criteria by which public controversies ought to be resolved. Some politicians embrace a Christian nationalist agenda or a white Christian nationalism, lacing their assertions about the nation's well-being with evangelical Protestant rhetoric. Many commentators imply that partisan loyalties, even devotion to a single outsized public figure, supersede common notions of moral virtue or veracity in debates about policy. Critics on the extremes of the political spectrum contend that Americans with different social or ethnic backgrounds hold such irreconcilable moral assumptions that it is futile to appeal to a shared moral sense or conscience as a means of mutual understanding or constructive debate. Such claims reduce politics to a contest for power among competing interest groups, privileging sheer polemic over public reason. Many of these issues, the religious identity of the nation, moral reasonableness as an adjudicator in public debate, and the meaning of moral conscience, are addressed in this book, albeit in 17th century and 18th century contexts and languages. This study is focused on the ways Protestants in England and America described non-Protestant religions, as well as the nature of the choice of one religion or another during the British colonization of America. Although it is chiefly a historical work, it concerns religious and moral dilemmas and proposals that might illumine by way of comparison and contrast some of the rhetoric that occupies today's headlines. For all of their peculiarities and contradictions, late 17th century and 18th century conceptions of moral reason and religious choice raise questions about some of the constricted notions that often beset our public life today. As the listener will find out, there is plenty to question about those early modern discourses, yet they might hold our interest long enough to cause us to ponder how they could inform our thinking about religion and politics, or at least provide an angle of reflection on our contemporary polemics. Introduction. Benjamin Webb, a Harvard graduate and pastor's son from Braintree, Massachusetts, served as an itinerant school teacher in the villages around Boston during the 1750s. Throughout his travels, he toted around a commonplace book in which he took notes on books from which he taught, Latin grammars, classical poetry, Locke's essay on human understanding. He also devoted one page of his notes to the Articles of the Mahometan faith. If Webb taught his students from those notes, then rural New England children learned about what he believed to be the 8 tenets of Islam: on God, Muhammad, purity rites, prayer, alms, fasting, pilgrimage, and prohibitions against alcohol and gambling, as well as Islamic teaching on such subjects as the difference between male and female souls. His notes demonstrate curiosity, not hostility. In the mid-18th century, many New Englanders sought out information on the various religions of the world. Jacob Bailey, another Harvard graduate and school teacher who eventually converted to the Church of England and became a missionary pastor, traveled through Nova Scotia during the same period that Webb was teaching school in Massachusetts. Bailey carried notes on Islam and Japanese religions, even as he recorded observations of indigenous traditions and the Catholicism of the Acadians. The minister in Grafton, Massachusetts, Aaron Hutchinson, a Yale graduate, devoted a part of nearly every Sunday service to praying for the conversion of non-Protestants. By the reminiscences of the Baptist elder John Leland, who attended Hutchinson's Congregational Church as a child, Hutchinson's prayers were exhausting, about 59 minutes long in Leland's painful memory. They went into great detail about Muslims, the pagan inhabitants of North America and Asia, Jews, and Roman Catholics. Knowledge of other religions went hand in hand with curiosity about conversion from one tradition to another. England and New England were saturated with tales in which people from far-flung corners came together, often to trade, and in the process switched religious allegiances. Boston newspapers provided breathtaking accounts of interreligious conversions, especially during the 1720s through the 1750s. They reported on Jews and Muslims who had come to embrace the Christian religion while in Rome and Amsterdam, and on Christians who had professed Islam in Algeria. They gave accounts of French missions among the Iroquois and of Mohawk sachems who walked the streets of Montreal wearing crucifixes. They relayed several narratives of the Christianization of Russia. They noted the conversion of Catholics to Protestantism in Hanover, Frankfurt, Salzburg, London, and Montpellier. They provided authoritative-sounding statistics from Jesuit missions in China. Precisely 69,318 converts and 400 priests ordained since the first mission. A trickle of reports became a flood. From the front page, they conveyed the notion that religious faith could be a deliberate choice rather than an inheritance. This was not merely a scholarly preoccupation. London's political essayist Thomas Gordon was so struck by Britain's interest in conversion that in 1719 he authored a tract that featured a fictional German doctor living in England who foresaw a worldwide deluge of religious change. The doctor predicted that Italian bishops would renounce the papacy, the French church embrace the Reformation, the people of Sweden and Scotland become Muslim, Genevans reunite with Rome, England become atheist, the Dutch entertain hundreds of religions, and the people of Africa convert to Christianity. It was pure parody, reflecting Gordon's opinion that the rage of conversion had gotten out of hand. Anglo-American Protestants' infatuation with conversion grew in the midst of a transformation in the ways that they thought about other religions. That transformation is the subject of this book. It focuses on writers who understood England's Protestant tradition to encompass not only the Church of England, but also some forms of dissent from the Church, such as the majority of churches in New England that expressed loyalty to England and traditional Protestant teaching. These Protestants can be called magisterial, meaning that they held a high regard for established laws and civil government, the magistracy. As used in this study, Anglo-American Protestants accordingly stands as shorthand for these broad-minded, magisterial, and often transatlantic-oriented Protestants. They produced the bulk of the period's writing on conversion, the world's religions, and the state, and this book relies on a variety of texts from their hands. This narrative begins in 1653, when, in the aftermath of the English Civil Wars, the first systematic publications on non-Christian religions appeared in English. It ends in 1765, when the imperial crisis between Britain and America began to reframe ideas about liberty of choice and reconfigure the political meaning of Protestant missions to Native Americans. Focused on London and Boston and its environs, two centers of Anglo-Protestant thought and of missionary activity, this study describes shifting stances, especially toward Roman Catholicism, Islam, the indigenous religions of Western Africa, and northeastern Native American traditions, with modest attention to East Asian religions. The opening of the Protestant Mind offers a narrative of change. From the 1650s through the restoration of the Stuart monarchy, 1660 through 1688, Anglo-American Protestants understood England and its American colonies as a confessional order. They maintained that the health of the state depended on a post-Civil War religious confession that would alleviate the disorders of the interregnum, the period from 1649 to 1660, when England had no monarch. To be sure, Anglicans and non-Anglican Protestants often differed on the scope of that confession. Many Anglican ecclesiastical officials denied the presumption that any church outside the Church of England represented true English Protestantism. Such sectarian jealousies among Protestants were important, but most of the subjects of this study nonetheless promoted a broad Protestant consensus for the sake of England's stability. Even as an elusive ideal, the notion of a Protestant confession or theological consensus provided a lens through which Anglo-American Protestants saw the world's religions. Anglicans and dissenters alike rejected all non-Protestant religions as illegitimate, dangerous, and demonic. They described conversion then chiefly as the submission of individuals to a version of Christian teaching, particularly Protestant doctrine, that was integral to England's identity. With their emphasis on the national character of religious confessions, England as Protestant, Spain as Catholic, Ottoman Turkey as Islamic, they only rarely contemplated the possibility of choosing one's religion. In religious missions, they believed that becoming English, at least in social and cultural terms, was a prerequisite for becoming Christian. Beginning with the Revolution of 1688, Anglo-American Protestants changed their orientation toward non-Protestant religions. They supported a regime in London known by the moniker Whig that relied on cooperation among an increasingly diverse collection of Anglicans, dissenters, and loyal Catholics. They depended on overseas commercial interactions with Muslims. They also attempted to form alliances with Native American communities in the midst of war with France. Whigs defended the Revolution of 1688 with appeals to Republican constitutional principles, including religious toleration, that implied a distinction between loyalty to the kingdom and conformity to any one creed. Partly in response to these shifting political circumstances, the figures discussed in this book jettisoned a confessional approach. They minimized theological orthodoxy as a prerequisite for patriotism. Instead, they thought that Whiggish moral virtues would unify the kingdom. They valorized sects or movements within a variety of traditions, Protestant, Catholic, Islamic, Native American, that sustained what they deemed as Republican ideas of toleration and moral virtue. They critiqued religious authorities within any tradition who, by their account, utilized state power or mystery-laden ceremonialism to coerce adherents. They offered a new interpretation of the religions of the world. Anglo-American Protestants accordingly changed their ideas about conversion and their strategies for the evangelization of non-Christians. During the first half of the 18th century, they came to idealize conversion as an uncoerced choice, grounded in Whiggish notions of moral liberty. In their missions to Native Americans, for example, they de-emphasized older demands for Englishness in favor of what they presumed were innate and universal moral principles that spanned English and indigenous cultures. Protestants across a wide theological spectrum came to promote persuasion as the most appropriate means of evangelization. To be sure, they pursued their mission in the context of the imperial struggle for North America. Their evangelistic ideas often functioned to justify the subjugation of indigenous people. Yet those ideas nonetheless contradicted imperial ideologies that dehumanized Native Americans by portraying them merely as unwitting and irrational, incapable of reason, civic virtue, and moral agency, and undeserving of religious liberty. This study touches on many issues such as religious toleration, Enlightenment moral thought, evangelicalism, imperial agendas, the state and secularism, missions, and racial ideologies that, in themselves, have each been the subject of a large and contested body of scholarship. They do not, however, drive its narrative. Instead, this book focuses on changing Anglo-American Protestant views of other religions and the importance of conceptions of moral liberty to that difference. The discourse itself is the central subject. Political factors loom large, however, in this intellectual history. Shifting perceptions of the means of political stability and prosperity led to changes in the ways that Anglo-American Protestants thought about religion in the public sphere. They considered a religion legitimate if they judged it to be beneficial to England's public order. That is not to deny that intellectual and theological convictions shaped political agendas. Religious ideas and political agendas developed in tandem, even though this narrative gives a leading role to the politics. In tracing these Protestant shifting ideas, this study admittedly addresses only part of the story of political power and religious comparison before American independence. It describes the views of separatist radical Protestants, French Catholics in Canada, or Muslim teachers who had conversations with Protestants, in only a few instances. It attends to the voices of indigenous adherents to traditional practices, as well as converts to Christianity, chiefly by way of parsing Protestant accounts of those voices. As incomplete as it is, however, the following study may help us to understand an important feature of the religious history of Anglo-American, the mind of those Protestants who often exercised power over the religious other in their spheres of influence. The resulting account offers a reading that differs in some respects from recent interpretations of the history of Protestant views of other religions. Intellectual historians have often emphasized the importance of what we can call, for short, an Enlightenment agenda. They focus on 17th and 18th century critiques of dogmatic Protestantism and support for a religion of reason, a secularized approach that was equally critical of all religious traditions. From this perspective, the central story concerns the triumph of reasonableness over theological stubbornness. One argument within this school of thought holds that a leading edge of Protestant scholars in the 17th century attempted to produce a genealogy of religious phenomena free from dogmatic bias and confessional strife. Early English deists in particular, these scholars maintain, valorized a natural religion shorn of what they held were the doctrines and ceremonial accretions as well as institutional obligations that had corrupted pure devotion and aroused controversy in post-Reformation Europe. This natural religion consisted chiefly of a small number of fundamental theological assertions, such as the existence of God and moral teaching. Historians who have worked within this paradigm maintain that their 17th century subjects, especially in England, promoted the notion that beneath the plurality of religions in the world, including ancient forms of devotion, was a common phenomenon, religion, that deserved recognition. The discovery of a natural religion at the core of all religions was, as this interpretation goes, integral to an open-minded and irenic approach to religious comparison. Other scholars have emphasized 18th century turns within an Enlightenment agenda, stressing a skeptical assault on all forms of orthodoxy. Historians who subscribe to this narrative contend that the emergence of a modern and reliable study of religions during the 1720s and 1730s reflected a resolutely secular mindset. They contend that the figures they have studied broke from 17th century orthodoxies and fashioned a popular version of religious comparison that elevated dispassionate and impartial description over Christian apologetics. Other historians have argued that 18th century books on world geography made advances from their predecessors with their reliance on empirical methods and taxonomic proficiency. While drawing on this body of scholarship, the following study recasts the 17th and 18th century narrative in several ways. First, it attends to a vernacular version of religious commentary rather than to the erudite commentary, chiefly from progressive or rationalist quarters, that has drawn the attention of other scholars. It focuses on popular observation and opinion, the stuff of middling intellectual culture, religious geographies and dictionaries, wondrous illustrations, travel accounts, diplomatic reports, merchants' and soldiers' diaries, sermons, and missionary tracts. By so doing, it recovers political and social agendas that sometimes go unarticulated by the specialized scholars of the 17th and 18th centuries. It sets the intellectual history in cultural and political context. It suggests, second, that many of the innovations of the period ought to be read not as efforts to craft a secular alternative to Protestantism, but as attempts to articulate the criteria by which religions could be judged as politically acceptable. Such criteria often accorded with traditional versions of what counted as orthodoxy within Protestant churches. Concerns for England's welfare explain how a broad coalition of Protestants, including Calvinists in England and New England, broad-minded Anglicans, and deists, took shape during the second half of the 17th century. A similarly expansive Protestant coalition, including evangelicals, was drawn together after 1688 by a discourse of religious liberty and reasonableness. That discourse provided standards by which to measure forms of devotion throughout the world. According to its advocates, religious practices were laudable if they evinced sociability, reasonableness, and regard for others' liberty of conscience, qualities, in their view, that made for a healthy state. Religio-political regimes in which a priestly class used elaborate ceremony to awe people into adherence by contrast were deemed suspicious. This moral discourse allowed for an appreciation of difference within religious traditions of any sort. Justification for the empire thus rested not on the received dogma of any one tradition as a whole, but on public virtues upheld by some groups within those traditions. 18th-century Britons on both sides of the Atlantic understood traditional Protestantism to be compatible with Enlightenment social mandates that sustained loyalty to Britain. Yet again, there is an abundant literature about the history of the discipline of religious studies in which several scholars have contended that writings on other religions from the late 16th through the 18th centuries reflected a largely unchanging and theologically inflected criticism of cultures outside of Protestant Western Europe. Such was the case, these scholars hold, until the emergence of the academic study of religion in Germany and England during the mid-19th century, the creation of what German scholars called the science of comparative religions, or Religionswissenschaft. Such contemporary historians of the discipline treat the story of the 17th and 18th centuries, quite briefly, as a tale of continuity. According to them, 18th-century commentators accumulated data about different traditions and developed a classification scheme for major Asian traditions, varieties of Buddhism, Confucianism, and Indian religions, but otherwise conformed their accounts to Protestant polemic. Judaism as an archaic predecessor to Christianity, Catholicism as a superstitious corruption, Islam as a violent deviation, indigenous traditions as irrational primitivism, and Asian religions as exotic idolatries. These historians of the field of comparative religions, along with theoretically oriented scholars of religion such as Jonathan Z. Smith, focus their attention on the development of generalized concepts of religion and its antithesis, the secular, as a post-18th century development. According to these scholars, Enlightenment-era notions of natural religion merely anticipated, in a shadowy form, the 19th century notion of religion as a discrete phenomenon. By this account, 19th century scholars developed the category of religion as a means of comparing different forms of devotion in an objective fashion. Yet, as this argument goes, the object called religion was nonetheless freighted with Protestant assumptions. As defined by English and German intellectuals, it minimized rituals as mere accidents that varied by tradition and maximized common theological beliefs as the essence of religion, with little explicit admission that such a definition elevated a Protestant emphasis on an individual belief at the expense of non-Protestant concerns for traditional, embodied, and communal practice. In a parallel interpretation, several contemporary critics have claimed that the category of the secular, the implied opposite of the term religion, was promoted in the post-Enlightenment West as a way to define a public sphere shorn of theological agendas and contentions. These critics argue, furthermore, that the secular carried an imperial and often racialized agenda. The rhetoric of Western civility and non-Western barbarity inflected its use. Western powers wielded the supposed superiority of their secularized politics as an instrument of control over non-Western nations and indigenous peoples. Other scholars within the field of religious studies have contended that the persistence of claims for the superiority of Christianity inflected Western imperialism and racism more powerfully than did the emergence of the secular. Catherine Ginn Lum, for example, has fastened on the trope heathen, used especially by missionaries as a Protestant devaluation of non-white, non-Western, non-modern, and non-Christian throughout the modern period. From this perspective, 17th or 18th century ideas of religious comparison can be portrayed merely as one phase in a continuous story of white supremacy that culminated in the 19th century American conquest of the continent and overseas empire. The opening of the Protestant mind does not dispute the whole of this overarching narrative. Recent studies of Protestant missions and of the rise of the study of comparative religions demonstrate multiple ways in which Protestants blended notions of white Protestant superiority, civility, and moral agency to justify their enslavement of African captives and their attempts to dominate indigenous people. Many of the purveyors of the discourse of religious comparison claimed empirical objectivity and moral reasonableness, but their comparisons often served colonial power in a variety of settings, including Southern Africa, colonial America, the southwestern United States, and Hawaii. Several scholars have shown that the implications even of the turn to moral liberty, a central theme of this study, were contradictory. The language of liberty of choice cut against the grain of the customary presuppositions that people's inherited identities, including race, determine their religious and moral character. At the same time, it reflected an imposition of Western notions of liberty on non-Western peoples. The history of Protestant discourses about non-Protestant religions and of North American missions belongs to a larger story of settler colonialism, racial construction, and slavery, a story that surfaces in this book, especially in the sections on Protestant descriptions of African and indigenous American religious practices. I have framed these issues, however, within an account of changes in the discourses about religion and conversion, thereby challenging some of the implications of the interpretations I have sketched here. Those changes complicate accounts of continuity within, or an ideological essence to, Anglo-American Protestantism in this period. The discourse around the religious other was not fixed, nor did it have univocal political implications. Some recent scholarship can give the misleading impression of an essentialized Protestantism, an irony for scholars who critique the notion of an essentialized religion throughout the modern period. By indicating the importance of variation in the discourse of religion and conversion, often contingent on shifting political contexts, this study prompts us to resist the notion of a single Anglo-American Protestant approach to religion, race, and empire. It calls into question the presumption that 17th and 18th century discourses were mere prelude to or anticipations of the fully developed and explicit racial ideologies that informed British and American colonial projects during the 19th century. In its focus on contingency and change, the opening of the Protestant mind also suggests that Anglo-American Protestant ideas offer alternatives as well as concessions to colonial ideas. It demonstrates, to mention just one example, that notions of a universal religious consciousness, and therefore some conception of religion, underwent several reformulations through the mid-18th century. 17th century Puritan discussions of true religion often rested on reformed ideas of right doctrine and an individual's awareness of their own depravity and need for saving faith. 18th century Protestants came to parse religious consciousness more expansively as an experience of anxiety and relief, fear and hope, affiliation and disaffiliation, which, at least by their lights, reflected traditional communal concerns. Protestant conceptions of religion were not always individualistic nor centered on cognitive beliefs. This book also uncovers contestation about the legitimacy of non-Protestant religions, the rightness of accepting non-Protestant cultural and social practices, or the utility of Western theological language in non-Western contexts. In recounting such complexities, this study suggests that Protestant discourse, like those of other religious traditions, could at times call into question or at least buffer imperial and racialized agendas, and could convey the need for exchange across cultural divides, just as it could serve as an instrument of cultural chauvinism and colonialist power. It worked both ways. My intent, then, is to expose the paradoxes of Protestants' ideas about non-Protestant religions, conversion, and religious liberty, the post-1688 monarchy and its imperial extensions, the leaders of the Hanoverian Empire, and...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?